Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here hosting, being part of this Outright 2021 Out Summit, represented for the Caribbean internationally, and of course here are some of the human rights defenders doing great work in the Caribbean on various issues with regards to women, girls, and LGBT. And of course this afternoon, we will be discussing tackling gender-based violence in the Caribbean and how it affects women, girls, and the LGBT community. Before we start and we get to introduce our panelists here this afternoon, I just want to share a few words about how gender-based violence is in the Caribbean. Gender-based violence against LGBT people in the Caribbean is an acute problem, amplified by the continued existence of colonial-era laws criminalizing same-sex relations, which on one hand normalize such violence, and on the other hand serve to keep up victims and survivors from reporting such violence or seeking other help. Tackling gender-based violence and ensuring service provision for LGBTQI victims and survivors is a key program area in the Caribbean. Of course, this afternoon here, we will discuss the prevalence of gender-based violence against LGBT persons, including that of women in the region, progress tackling it so far, and the strategies, increasing policies and legal protections for LGBTQI survivors of gender-based violence in the future now, and of course, now. Let me introduce myself. I am Jessica St. Rose. I'm an executive director of United and Strong in St. Lucia. I'm also the founder of 758 Pride. I am also the co-founder of the Regional Organization of Women in Leadership. I am also an Outright Advocacy Week graduate alumni, so it is such a pleasure here to moderate this evening's panel discussion. Of course, we have here from St. Lucia, again, Catherine Sealys from Raise Your Voice, the president of Raise Your Voice, Elysse Masle, the Director and Business Development Officer of Romantra from Trinidad, and Alexandrina Wong, Women Against Rape Antigua. So before we start, if we could start with Raise Your Voice St. Lucia and tell us about you and introduce yourself and the work that you do with regards to gender-based violence in St. Lucia generally. Thank you, Catherine.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Catherine Sealys. I am the president of Raise Your Voice St. Lucia. Our work is strictly with gender-based violence victims in the first instance. So day in, day out, we work with gender-based violence victims. For as far back as 2015, we have worked with LGBTQI people who are victims of gender-based violence. And along the way, we have picked up a lot of capacity on how to provide support services to LGBTQI members of who are locally based and need gender-based violence support services. Our work is multidimensional. So we do gender-based violence support services and advocacy and other things. So our support services include legal aid, mental health support, safe houses, victims aid, and welfare, which includes educational support, medical support, food support, which has been a big part of our work since May last year because of COVID, and educational support, which became very, very critical when everything moved to digital platforms and a number of people were not able to afford because they didn't have access. We have had quite a challenge dealing with the rising numbers of gender-based violence, specifically sexual crimes against children, boys, girls, women, and it has been challenging in the sense that because of COVID, all our services, we had to digitize all our services and put most of our services virtual, including our counseling services. So we are just now beginning to get a proper hang of how to do things virtually. It's working out, but there's nothing like face-to-face. So we are happy to be here and to speak about what we do, how we do it. And it has always been very, very important that we speak about our work, participate in forums like this, because we have received quite a lot of support from Outright Action International. Our capacity to be able to deal with gender-based violence victims who are LGBT members have been given to us by them. So we look forward to this discussion, and we look forward to learning. We look forward to understanding a little more.
Thank you so much, Catherine. You spoke a lot about the key positive areas that your organization brings about for LGBT persons and women in general. And that is good knowing, especially knowing that during COVID, there was an increase in gender-based violence among women, knowing that persons are mostly confined to their homes and having to deal with their partners. And of course, partners not being able, a lot of homes are being distorted in regards to gender-based violence. So I understand, and I heard a lot of the key positive contributions that your organization has done for women, girls, boys, LGBT persons in St. Lucia as it relates to gender-based violence. And I will go over to Trinidad, Elysse, who can also tell us some of the key positive changes that her organization and her country in general has made in relation to protecting women and LGBT persons against gender-based violence.
Yes, thanks for that, Jessica. So Womandra specifically has been working with Outright over the last couple of years on the Frontline Alliance and Gender-Based Violence project. And one of our key roles in that during phase one was to train first responders in how to work with gender-based violence victims, both women and LGBT identified people. And I think that was a really instrumental part of the efforts towards ensuring that, you know, state actors and those who are responsible for working with those who are surviving or trying to escape violence are sensitized as to how to address these populations. And one of the interesting things that we kind of learned through that was that I think people are hesitant to discuss this topic of LGBT identified people's rights and these things. But I think when you bring it back home to them from the perspective of, well, you know, people are just trying to survive and they just want to be treated with respect, it makes it a lot easier to digest. And so that was part of the work we've done. And this year, through Outright support as well, what we'll be looking at is how the recently amended Domestic Violence Act, whether or not it is actually, in fact, working to protect LGBT identified people. Because with this recent amendment, they've introduced this dating clause, which uses pretty broad language to define who is identified as being in a dating relationship. And of course, you know, there's this sort of attitude like, well, we're not really going to protect LGBT people, but it is open now because they have not used the same language that they've used in other clauses like visiting relationship and cohabitant. All of them use gendered language like man and woman, husband and wife, whereas the dating relationship clause is open. And so we would like to investigate whether or not people who are in same-sex or same-gender relationships have been able to access justice through that clause. So over the next year, we will be partnering with various organizations who do work in this area to see if this clause has in fact benefited the community in any way, which we hope would be able to inform further efforts to sort of just amend the entire legislation to be protective of everyone. And of course, last year in 2020, the Gender-Based Violence Unit was launched, which was launched by the now, I suppose, the now past police commissioner, because his term ended this year. But he had a very specific and vocal interest in ensuring that LGBT people were protected through his new unit. And he is, unfortunately or fortunately, however you look at it, the only state actor to explicitly emphasize the need to protect LGBT people and his intention to do so. So, of course, his entire tenure is a contentious one, and he himself is a contentious character. But in a weird way, this was a progressive step forwards for LGBT people to be able to recognize that at the very least, the highest level of the police service is saying that this is his priority, this is something he cares about. These are two, I think, like national level areas of progress that are going to be interesting to continue observing as time passes. And I'll stop there for now, and we could probably talk more about some of the work and stuff later on in the conversation.
Okay, I'm happy that you actually mentioned the new Gender-Based Violence Act and the unit that Trinidad has brought on now, but we'll go into that more because I want to know about the impact that this can have on the community. So we will discuss that later on. But thank you for raising that point. Alexandrina, if you're there, if we can talk about some of the key changes and the positive key changes that your country and also your organization has made in relation to protecting women against and LGBT against domestic gender-based violence.
Thank you, Jessica. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alexandrina Wong, Executive Director of the NGO Women Against Rape in Antigua and Barbuda. Our primary constituency services geared towards women and families affected by gender-based violence. Our Gender-Based Violence Act of 2015, while it is couched in heterosexual terms, there is room to negotiate discussions for same-sex relations. For example, when reports are documented and they have the clause which states of the same address, John Tom and Moses John of the same address, gives us a kind of leeway to address same-sex unions that persons may be occupying the same physical address. In addition to that, with recent funding from PATF, we were able to support the first gender caucus hosted by the women parliamentarians in Antigua and Barbuda. Our primary aim at the meeting was to focus on the laws that impact negatively on the lives of women and LGBTQI persons. When we looked at the Sexual Offences Act, we are looking at a particular area which deals with the redefining of the term rape. In the Antigua context, rape specifically addresses penetration. So if we were to redefine rape and remove that word penetration, we will also be looking at other forms of sexual acts that can be redefined and the entire act of itself redefined. So the emphasis will be taken away from the buggery clause. In addition to that, what I would like to say as well is that one of the gaps in our service is that there is no designated space for battered women or vulnerable populations in times of crisis. And that puts us in a precarious situation, as it were. Hence my recent press release, Nowhere to Run To in Times of Crisis. We have had an upsurge in the killings of women in 2021. 4 women were brutally killed, stabbed and shot while in their bed and so on. And so it's a serious cause for concern, which indicates that my organization has to continue its advocacy. And so we're very happy that we are being funded by Outright to address gender-based violence affecting women and the LGBTQI community. We have already met with and implemented an activity looking at violence and harassment in the workplace in partnership with the Ministry of Labor and trade unions. So at this point in time, my organization has been able, through other fundings as well, to strengthen our community base, which is very, very, very strong. And we have focal points in the various parishes. And so while we continue our virtual conversations and addressing needs of the vulnerable populations, we are also in a time and space in our country where we can have in-person gatherings. And so our workshops will continue, and we are looking at different advocacy strategies. One of the most recent one is the electronic billboard ad, ratify ILO C-190. And there's much more room for us to continue to advocate so that the human rights of women and LGBTQI persons can be adequately addressed. So one of that is the whole litigation process, and Antigua has started just a few weeks ago. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Indeed, a lot of work being done by you and your organization. And I'm so sorry to hear about the increasing murders and women. I know in St. Lucia, 2020 was a hard year, knowing, especially having been confined to the homes. And we saw an increase in that. And I'm sure Capri could tell us a lot more about that in terms of the existing challenges, because you also spoke, Alexandrina, about existing challenges in your recent article, Nowhere to Run. And that headline says a lot, not just as an organization, but as a country on a whole. And I know it's something that a lot of us small island states deal with, where we have a lot of challenges with the powers that be to provide policies and legal frameworks for effective protection for women and LGBT persons. So Catherine, if you could tell us some of the existing challenges that you have been experiencing as someone who heavily advocates for the rights of women, children, girls, LGBT persons in St. Lucia, especially in the COVID context, and how dampening 2020 has been for women with regards to an LGBT person, with regards to gender-based violence.
Thanks, Jessica. We are doing a small project. This was our activity for 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And our project was to every day post one woman who had been killed in a gender-based violence incident. And in the lead up to this project, it's 16 days, and we ended up with over 50 women who had been killed from 1994 to now. 2011 was the deadliest year, 2011, 2017, and 2019. So we're at the 16 days, at the end of the 16 days, and we still have about 50 something women we have to post, so we decided to continue. I say this because gender-based violence in St. Lucia has always been terrible. The support services has always been non-existent with a number of gaps. We have one shelter is in the north of the island, and the capacity is up to maybe 5 to 7 people. We as an organization provide safe space, and we provide safe space for about 26 people. At any given time, we are always overcrowded, and we sometimes have to turn people away, or we sometimes have to source spaces at private places and pay for them. We have been advocating for quite a while to update the Domestic Violence Act. It has been updated, and it's a document that we are quite proud of, because I want to refer to Alexandrina's comment. The Gender-Based Violence Act is completely gender neutral. It doesn't create any barriers at any given time. I cannot promise that they will not have barriers, because it is people do provide the services, and you never know what they will do. but the legislation itself does not. We are hoping between now and January it will be through the Parliament of St. Lucia. We have had the discussions, we have had the meetings, we have had the campaigning, we have had the advocacy, and we have agreement from the legislators. We look forward to that. We also look forward to the government of St. Lucia doing an amendment to the criminal code, which has been promised, to delete section 133 from the criminal code, which criminalizes same-sex relationships. It has been discussed and it has been agreed upon. And we will continue to advocate on this along with United and Strong, ICADE, and everybody else. This year, this last 20 months from May 2020, the cases of domestic violence has been so high that at some point or another we thought, well, maybe people were calling us alone. But when we did a little background research, we realized it wasn't so. But what is most critical in this time, sexual violence is higher than domestic violence, so you can imagine. We have had a number of cases, especially when there is curfew and there is confinement to homes and predators know women, children are home alone. We have had very, very many cases, which has been really, really troubling to us and our organization, and the level of effort it takes for us to deal with them. Over the last 20 months, the LGBT community has had a number of challenges because, you know, they have already marginalized. There are so many issues with them cohabiting with family, friends, and other people. So they lost their job, they are home now. Then they start to complain, and a number of times families would put them out of their homes. A number of times mothers and fathers would put their children out of their homes. So we have had to make special provision to get a separate dedicated house, because we realize that while we have a better understanding how to provide domestic violence support services to them, I do not think they appreciate being together with heterosexual people in one space. So we had to make separate arrangements for them. And it's a challenge for us both financially and logistically, but we try. The idea that Section 150 will be repealed and everything will be okay is just a thought and a dream. And we are hoping that both the LGBT community people and ourselves and everybody else demand that there be more. Something such as an organization like a human rights organization in St. Lucia. We don't have one of those, so that the rights of people can be, and there is a little more accountability within the social services that provide support services, because this is where you get the problem where people disregard the law and they go with their gut feeling and their cultural norms and all their beliefs and everything else. Gender-based violence in St. Lucia is not something that started because of COVID. It is something that COVID really exposed. It has always been really, really bad. But people paid attention because everybody else paid attention and everybody else was speaking up. So people had to speak up and people had to bring it to the front of the table. But gender-based violence in St. Lucia has been very, very bad from 1994, when a woman was beheaded because her husband had raped her 2-year-old. It has not been any better. And we have so many cases that when we were doing research prior to 16 days of advocacy, while we had been doing this work for quite a while, since 2012, we were shocked of the number of cases that had happened prior to us forming these organizations.
Thank you so much for this, Catherine. And you did indeed mention a lot of the challenges that I myself, as an activist working in the LGBT organization, is very much aware, especially in terms of the homelessness and LGBT persons being abandoned by their families and having to find safe spaces to put their dispositions. And I know that you're doing a lot of work with regards to that and working with United and Strong. And you mentioned something very specific. And also I can look at that as an innovative measure where we could have the human rights office to look at these specific issues. I think there is a human rights unit in the ministry. I came across it on Instagram or Facebook. I usually come across the page, but I'm not too sure. I have not heard from them much as an individual, as an organization. I think we have been invited to one consultation, but it's something that can be explored, and it's another innovative idea. So if Elysse, if you could share with us maybe some of the innovative ideas or measures that can be used in response and prevention that we can adopt, or as organizations or as a country can adopt in a Caribbean space. And if you can explain why these measures are important, because it is important. Catherine made a very strong point that we need strategies to enhance and to bring about better protection. So if you could share with us some innovative ideas as an organization and as a country in the Caribbean space, and why these measures are important to tackle gender-based violence.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much for that question. I mean, it's a broad question, right? And answering it would probably take many more hours of, cogent thought and analysis. But I think some key things that have emerged to me in the work and in being in this space that are necessary is one is recognizing the impact of colonialism and where we are, and recognizing that where we are right now isn't a chance. It's not by chance, it was by design. And that the fight we have against violence requires us to address the national epidemic of violence that exists in many of our territories. So there's violence towards children, there's violence towards women, there's violence towards all forms of minority groups. And you're seeing, for example, now with the migration of Spanish-speaking migrants, particularly from Venezuela, you're seeing now like xenophobia becoming a very common part of the narrative. You're seeing now with COVID, there's this sort of rift between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, with people thinking that there needs to be more harsh measures taken against people for not conforming in particular ways. And so generally, I think that what we are witnessing in our region is a culture of violence as a whole that needs to be addressed. And I think that starts with us, one, recognizing that our movements are not actually isolated. Even within the LGBT space, there is antagonism from people who, for example, don't think bisexuals are legitimate, or don't think trans identities are legitimate, or don't think intersex identities should be within this space. And all of these identities then become new layers upon which we divide and become antagonistic towards one another, instead of recognizing that the system as a whole is oppressive, and it is choosing these identities to oppress in specific ways. But at the end of the day, we are actually all experiencing the same overarching vulnerabilities that just manifest perhaps in more unique ways. And when you recognize that we've been taken so far away from our indigenous roots and our indigenous cultures that would have had space for diversity, you recognize that it means that we actually have to come now from a more holistic cultural identity, recognizing our ancestors' traditions, and creating new avenues to, I think, bring those back to current consciousness, right? So, for example, I was reading about the Mali Kingdom in ancient Africa, in which there was actually something equivalent to a Ministry of Diversity or Ministry of what was it, boy, like vulnerable people. And so this ministry essentially served the purpose of ensuring that minority groups in this kingdom were taken care of. And I thought, when I read about that, I thought, imagine this was thousands of years ago, that our ancestors seem to have had the right answers. The fact that we have been removed from these systems was by design and was intentional. And it was designed for us to be able to have these sort of separate identities that can be exploited, that can be oppressed. And so in terms of innovating, I think one of the things that we have to do is to actually bridge divides, is to get to a point where we are working together and not in opposition to one another, to recognize that we are all being stripped of our humanity, and that deprivation from humanity, that alienation from humanity is just assigning another label to it, right? But at the end of the day, we are all being deprived of humanity. And I think in bridging those divides, we then become powerful. I mean, we've all grown up hearing there's power in numbers, I think we become more powerful when we recognize that we, the people, actually do have the power. We just have to work together and take it, as opposed to continuing to leave it vested in the hands of a minority elite whose interests are largely driven by profit and by, networks and these kinds of things that are exploitative and exclusionary. And I think that when it comes to legislation, we have a tendency to sort of focus on these areas because that's what funding also focuses on, right? We kind of go towards where the money goes. And unfortunately, a lot of funders focus more explicitly on, well, let's engage in legislative change. But I think the research shows that legislation is actually not the most effective way at changing the status quo. It's just one tool. And oftentimes the culture around the legislation doesn't necessarily change with it. And we can see that, for example, in the US, what's happening right now with active attempts to roll back progressive legislation because the societal atmosphere didn't move forward with the legislation, right? So I think that there has to be community work taking place so that once we build these bridges across movements, we have environmental activists, women's rights activists, LGBT activists, labor activists, if all of us build bridges and then start to develop systems that appreciate humanity and the dignity of all humans, then there is no longer a need to continue focusing on, well, this specific group needs to also be given rights. Instead, we can focus on language of all of us have an obligation to be humane to others. And I think developing programs that try and teach that and reinforce that is where we can start. And I really love that in Barbados' new charter, Article 1 talks about rights being afforded and dignity being afforded to everyone, irrespective of, and they've included sexual orientation, gender, and sex. But then I think it's Article 2 that also talks about to be part of a civil society, you have rights, but you also have a duty. And I think that is another language shift that has to take place, is that we have to recognize that we all have a responsibility to ensure that our neighbors are kept safe and that they are treated with respect and dignity. And I think that requires efforts towards cultural change as well.
Thank you so much for this, Elysse. Indeed, shifting the entire narrative around the Caribbean and the whole cultural narrative. And of course, in your reading, we saw that our ancestors had the foresight, but it was taken away from us. And looking at it holistically can drive change and can bring around change, but we need the constant activism to enhance that and to keep that at the top of our list. And I remember in my 2-day meeting, which Alexandrina was at, shifting the narrative and looking at it holistically. One of the participants at the meeting talked about working with immigration officers and policemen on migrant sex workers. And I asked the question, how is that able to come about? And the participants who worked on the project indicated that they worked with allies, and not just working with allies, but talking about migrant sex workers. And if you want to also include gender-based violence, looking at the person as an individual and not just, okay, this is a sex worker and this is a LGBT person, this is a gay person. We're not looking at it that, but we're looking at it holistically. So the narrative change and the cultural change is important, and also bringing back the foresight of our ancestors so that we can get to a point where we can look at violence as an issue that needs to be seriously taken up. So Alexandrina, if you could tell us probably some of the innovative ways, like I mentioned in Antigua, that for me was an innovative way to have and to work together with immigration officers and police officers, even if there are allies, but to tackle these specific focus areas with key populations. That for me is an innovative way, and I applaud Antigua for bringing that up, for doing such a good thing. So if you could share with us, Alexandrina, some innovative ways that we can use as countries, as activists, as individuals, as organizations to tackle gender-based violence on a country level.
Thank you very much. In our very early days in 2007, 2008, 2009, we recognized that there was a pushback both from the law enforcement and from the healthcare provider segment. And because I have served as a district nurse midwife, I have had alliances with both sets of workers over the years. And so I wouldn't say it was challenging first to get them to understand when we speak of gender as a social construct, what it is we are speaking about. Because some persons, as soon as they hear the word gender, they think LGBTI, they think man and woman story. So as Elysse said, there has to be a cultural shift, and that has to come with constant talking, intervention, sensitization. There is still very much the emphasis on man as the head of the household concept. So a single woman is not given the same respect, the same dignity, and she's carrying out similar functions. She's carrying out more because she has to work outside of the home, and then she still has the unpaid care work that she's doing at home. And so we looked around for funding to address training of police officers and allied health workers. And in 2018, we got a grant from Outright, and we were able to train persons from law enforcement and from the health and allied sectors. We have seen some change, as minimal as they are, because now I can speak to someone at the immigration department and explain the situation, and they can arrange an appointment for persons to come in. We have also created linkages between NGOs and the formal health system. And so we can speak now to Social Security and get sex workers into the Social Security as well as the medical benefits system using using different ways and means and pathways. So once they get into those systems, they can access care free of cost at the government community clinics. Earlier up, in the former political administration, there were a number of Canadian police who were brought in to head the task force because of the increased incidents in gender-based violence and sexual assaults. And we were able to establish a good relationship with them as well. We met with them monthly. We reviewed the cases. We were given updates onto of the status of the different cases. Unfortunately, however, they left. But I am still saying that we still have those linkages that were formed through funding from CVC some years after, which looked at the relationship between CBOs, NGOs, and the formal health system. So what we have done is create an informal network. So when we are referring someone, we know directly to whom we are sending that person in the system. So we will call beforehand, and we also have a virtual referral form, which we would send beforehand. And that referral form has a portion that can be torn off and used as an exit strategy, which that person can write on, which the recipient of the care can write their experience of the service on, take a picture with their phone and send it back to us. So we know which provider and which agency are still lagging behind. And so when we hold our trainings now, we can know who we need to pull in and what our topics should be. So that has been our strategy, and it is working well for us. And also earlier in the year, when there was limited face-to-face, we focused a lot on gender sensitive care in the community. And so we have expanded our community-based advocates who know their parish, know their village, and so they can feed information up to us. So it's networks within networks coming together, sharing experiences, understanding where we at, and at the same time helping us to understand where we need to go, especially following the impact that COVID has had on our organizations, on our individual lives, and on the various communities that we serve as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Indeed, a lot of work, a lot of collaborations and networking that I can see that's going well for you and for your organization. Catherine, I think I needed to come to you because based on what Alex has been saying, she's been having a good rapport with the various units that deal with vulnerable persons and all that. What has been your experience specific to your organization in St. Lucia, Catherine, with regards to the vulnerable persons unit, social services in St. Lucia? I know you're always raising your voice on the airwaves about this. So if you could share with us a bit of your experience with that.
Our relationship with social services agencies is like, I'm not sure, maybe 1 minute it's up, 1 minute it's down. We collaborate a lot with them. We work with them, we do referrals, they send referrals to us. However, we advocate very strongly when we feel that they have violated the rights of people who go to them for services. And we speak clearly and we speak loudly and we speak publicly about their behavior. And we hope that our advocacy causes them to check on the state of service delivery or the quality or the way they deliver service. So while we work closely with them, and we've worked quite closely, we've spent a lot of resources, all their trainings from 2015, we have gotten funding and done all their training. Earlier this year, we refurbished the counseling room for the VPT unit because we felt that it was not a safe space and it was not a pleasant place, for especially for children who had gone through some kind of trauma. And we share our resources with them. For example, we are doing a project right now. We are doing training for them again. We are going into the Christmas season and we are having some activities to provide some relief to things. And we have asked them to submit some of the people they work with who may need help. However, we stand strongly on the fact that just because we collaborate with you and we work with you and we provide training, we are not going to allow you to do as you please and continue to violate the rights of marginalized persons who come to your agency. And we also continue to advocate strongly that government of St. Lucia put an agency, a commission, equal opportunity commission, equal rights commission in St. Lucia, and to have an independent body looking at the question of accountability within the social services and the question of quality of service delivery. There are a number of gaps. We just finished do a stakeholder mapping exercise. There are a number of gaps that needs to be fixed. We got some funding from Outright, and the project is a 2-year project. So we have expanded the project to do a gap survey, a service mapping survey, a gender-based violence perspective survey both among the youth and social services. So we've come out with quite a bit of information and the way forward. It can determine the way forward and what kind of training and what is necessary. We understand that the public service has a lot of gaps. We still do not think abuses to people, especially LGBTQI people who go for things such as healthcare and other support services, should be different than anybody else. We're in 2021. This has to change. Everybody has to do better.
Excellent. It's very important that we advocate for the respect of persons who go to these spaces to get services, because we don't want to push people back, and we want to continue allowing persons to know that there are spaces, there are safe spaces that are for them. And I must commend you every day, Catherine, for the work that you do with regards to that, because the voices are needed. And this goes to my next question. Before we wrap up, we have a few more minutes, 5 more minutes before we wrap up. I will go to Elysse. With regards to everything that we've spoken about and the changes that we want to see happen and the changes that we continue to advocate for as activists, as human rights defenders, do you think that in a time now where we're trying to change the narrative, that governments, we should see more activists in government positions, more activists going into politics to help change the language around, and not just the language of minority groups, but the language holistically? Do you think that we should see that movement coming across now in the Caribbean, Trinidad, wherever, but regionally? Tell me what you think.
That's a fantastic question. Honestly, I think it's a necessary part of the move towards progress. But I think the challenge is that because our political systems were designed by people who intended for us to not have access to power, it's not really as easy as you just get into it and it changes the status quo, right? Because I remember learning from Suniti Miraj, who is an excellent historical storyteller, if you ask me, whenever she talks about the history of Trinidad and Tobago. So it's fascinating. But I remember learning from her about the fact that Trinidad was the first crown colony, wherein it was the first British colony where they perfected this model of governance, where they could maintain rule over an entire, different groups of people all the way from the UK. And they never had to set foot here other than to send a governor. And I think when you understand that's how our political systems have been designed, it was really for them to maintain power overseas. You understand why we can't just simply get into them and change status quo. They are not designed to be changed. So I think in a real way, yes, we should be taking up space in the political arena, and we should be trying to change things from the inside. But really and truly, from a long-term perspective, the answer actually has to be systemic change. We have to dismantle what exists almost entirely for it to be rebuilt into something that is more representative of our needs and our politics as a community. And I think that starts from us deciding who we are as political actors. So yes, but it's a long journey.
Yes, indeed, it is a long journey. And of course, getting rid of that old narrative and making way for the new, I think that's where we need to go. That's what we want to see. And I think I see it a bit happening now with more younger people taking up that mantle and wanting to step forward with that. So I believe it can happen. It may take a little more time, but in the future, it will happen, definitely. We're about to wrap up, but any closing remarks from Alexandrina, Catherine, and Elysse before we call it off? If you could just tell us your closing remarks this afternoon about your organization and how we can move forward with gender-based violence in the Caribbean. Just a few lines, 2 lines. Alex, you wanna go first? Your mic is muted.
Thank you. This has been an excellent opportunity for us to talk across borders, talk about across what each of us are doing, and an excellent opportunity for us to build and strengthen the alliances and look at the gaps that we all have and work together collectively to see how we can address those gaps. So thanks for the opportunity to share, and I know we can and we will. Thank you.
Thank you. Elysse and Catherine, 2 words.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak and to collaborate, and for Outright always looking out for Caribbean advocates. And we are very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you. And Elysse, closing words.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks as well. And I think my final message would just be that part of the advocacy and the work that we have to do also has to start with us. So I just want to remind anybody who's looking on and listening that the work you do on yourself contributes to the work of the whole, and to just keep at it.
Thank you so much. Excellent way to end, Elysse. Working on yourself contributes to the work that we want to see happening. So thank you so much, Outright, for having me as your moderator, Jessica St. Rose, and my wonderful panelists doing amazing work in the Caribbean. You know, we have to continue lobbying and getting it out there, and one day we will see what we want to see happen in the real world, and the real world meaning the more positive world with regards to minority groups. So thank you once again, and have a good evening, everyone.